Hi everybody, this is Doug from the blog, Essays in Idleness, here to bring you another video in our series on Buddhism Q&A. Now today's episode is a little bit different because I didn't take a viewer question. Instead I decided to kind of post a special one-off topic for today's Buddhism Q&A, and that is the subject of Pure Land Buddhism. Now Pure Land Buddhism is something that I did not even know existed until 2005. When I was younger, my interest was mostly in Japanese Zen Buddhism, stuff like that. Later on I ended up marrying my wife, who's Japanese, and we went to Japan one year, 2005, and I visited this temple called Chionin, which is a very large and famous temple in the city of Kyoto. And there I saw something I'd never seen before, a Buddhist statue I'd never seen before, and I saw a monk sitting before it, kind of chanting something. And through a series of kind of events after that, I sort of got into this thing called Pure Land Buddhism. Now, when I did the Beginner Buddhism series, I kept everything as agnostic as I could, meaning not to focus on any particular sect or anything like that, just to try and give kind of as broad general Buddhism as I could. However, this video is kind of more devoted to Pure Land Buddhism only, because I am actually a Pure Land Buddhist. And so I wanted to cover several topics. What is the Pure Land? What is Amitabha Buddha? What are the different ways it's approached throughout Asia? What are its origins, and so on and so forth. So definitely this video is a little more biased than some of the other videos, but I hope you find this useful to kind of help explain this important phenomenon within East Asian Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism. So Buddhism, particularly Mahayana Buddhism, can be kind of divided into three really broad categories. And this is true with any country that you visit. You have sort of meditation-style Buddhism. This is usually, for example, Zen, but also related Buddhist sects, Son Buddhism in Korea, Chan Buddhism in China, Tien Buddhism in Vietnam, and so on. You also have your esoteric Buddhism, which is very common in Tibet, and to a lesser degree in China and Japan. And third, you have sort of devotional Buddhism, and this can be really devoted to any of the Buddhist deities. This was covered in Beginner Buddhism Series 1, Lesson 9. But one particular deity, one particular figure in Buddhism has become sort of so popular that it's sort of branched off into its own kind of branch, and this is what we call Pure Land Buddhism. Now the special Buddha I'm talking about is a Buddha called Amitabha Buddha, which is also known as the Buddha of Infinite Light. You can usually recognize a statue of Amitabha Buddha because usually we'll have the rays of light shining around his head, and sometimes he'll be in a posture kind of like this or something similar. Now the story of Amitabha Buddha, according to the traditional Mahayana sutras, is this. Many eons ago, there was a king who was a great and wise king, and he encountered a different Buddha called Lokeshvaraja Buddha, the world sovereign Buddha. And the king was so greatly impressed with this message, he decided to renounce everything he had and to become a Buddha himself, to save and rescue all beings. As part of this, and this is part of something that every bodhisattva does, every being who is striving for full enlightenment, a bodhisattva makes a series of vows, and then upon fulfilling those, they become a Buddha, a fully enlightened being, according to the traditional accounts. So, in the case of this king, he made 48 vows that he would establish a great Pure Land as a refuge for all beings. And out of these 48 vows, the most famous vow is this. If, when I attain Buddhahood, sentient beings in the lands of the 10 directions who sincerely and joyfully entrust themselves to me, desire to be born in my land, and think of me even 10 times, should not be born in my land, may I not obtain perfect enlightenment. But this can also be read as if people were to call his name 10 times, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But this vow, and this is the most important, but according to the stories, according to the sutras, this king performed many great practices over a very long span of time, over many lifetimes, and eventually achieved his enlightenment, became a Buddha called Amitabha, and as a result of his accomplishment, the Pure Land was established. Now, although, especially in Mahayana Buddhism, every Buddha fulfills their vows as a bodhisattva and establishes a Pure Land of their own. The reason why Amitabha Buddha's Pure Land is so famous, because it's so easy to get to, as we said, according to his vow, a person could recite his name or just think of him 10 times and be reborn there upon death. The other reason also is because, according to the sutras, Amitabha Buddha's light shines across all the universe infinitely, illuminating beings, helping them be free of ignorance and hatred and things like that. And the Pure Land itself is regularly described in the sutras as being this wonderful place with gold jewels hanging out of trees, ponds with great big lotuses of red, and white, and blue light, and so on and so forth. So when a person hears this, especially if they've not really encountered Buddhism before, their first thought is, hey, wait a minute, this sounds a lot like heaven in Christianity, or heaven in general in Judaism or Islam, and so on and so forth. But there's some important differences. The first big difference is that, as I said earlier, every Buddha establishes a Pure Land. The medicine Buddha has a Pure Land, which is called lapis lazuli, as in the color dark blue. And also Akshobhya Buddha, the unmovable Buddha, has his own Pure Land. Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, supposedly has a Pure Land, as described in chapter 16 of the Lotus Sutra. His Pure Land happens to be on this world, where he preached his sermons and stuff, but he was no exception. And so the notion of Pure Land is not a single place, but it's something that is part of a natural course for a Buddha when they become enlightened. Now, what about all the great delights and so on and so forth? The purpose of the Pure Land is also quite different than Western notions of heaven. The reason is that a Pure Land is established by Buddha as a form of refuge for beings. Beings who are trapped under difficult circumstances can take refuge in that Pure Land, be reborn there after death. And so in that Pure Land, they can then have progress along the path much easier because they have a lot fewer obstructions. They don't have to worry about fighting or safety or things like that. It's a safe place. All their needs are taken care of. And they're surrounded by many great teachers, including a Buddha, a living Buddha, as opposed to one that passed away a long time ago. This is, again, intended as a refuge or a place to further one's practice on the road to enlightenment, nirvana, and so on. All the stuff that we are familiar with with Buddhism. But also another thing about this notion of Pure Land Buddhism is that the idea behind it is not necessarily a new one, because in the original Buddhism, Buddhism from the time of the Buddha himself, many of the sutras speak of the notion of recollecting a Buddha. This is called anusmriti in Sanskrit, or in the Pali language, anusati. And the idea is this, as the Buddha described it, in one sutra, as a disciple is recollecting the Tathagata, the Buddha, his mind is calmed, and joy arises, the defilements of his mind are abandoned, and so on and so forth. In other words, this is a very common practice from the beginning of Buddhism to visually recollect the virtues and bring the image of a Buddha to mind, because it would cultivate wholesome qualities in yourself. And so the idea in Pure Land Buddhism of calling the name of a Buddha or visualizing the Buddha of infinite light is sort of an extension of this. And it's even mentioned in the Lotus Sutra as well. For example, in one passage that's really well known, it says, if anyone, even while distracted, enters a stupa or mausoleum, and even once exclaims, "Hail to the Buddha," they have fulfilled the Buddha way. Now, Pure Land Buddhism, as a phenomenon in Mahayana Buddhism, is not necessarily different, or not necessarily mutually exclusive from other Buddhist groups. So, for example, a lot of monastics in mainland Asia will recite the name of Amitabha Buddha, but as part of their daily practice. But they will also practice meditation and other things. These are not mutually exclusive. Or, for example, in the esoteric Buddhist groups, Vajrayana, like in Tibet and stuff like that, one of the practices might be to visualize the Pure Land or of Amitabha's virtuous qualities himself. In Japan, there's a little bit of a difference because for historical reasons, the different groups kind of tend to split more than converge. So in Japan, you do have Buddhist groups that are exclusively focused on Pure Land Buddhism itself. But all of these different groups have the same basic thing in common, that is two things. One is a focus on getting reborn in the Pure Land. Again, the Pure Land acting as a refuge or place to a safe place for one to further one's Buddhist practice, a very conducive place. And two, the means to doing this is usually either to visualize or recollect the Buddha, or to recite his name. So, for example, many groups, and especially lay people, will often put their hands together and say something like "Hail to Amitabha Buddha." And different languages will have different ways of saying this. For example, in Japanese, it's Namo Amitabha. In Korean, it's Namo Amitabha. Chinese is Namo Amitofo, or something like that. I may be wrong. And Vietnamese is Namo Azidafat. But basically, it's the same thing. Hail to Amitabha Buddha. And the idea is, again, based on the 18th vow that we mentioned earlier, and the promise of Amitabha Buddha to rescue all beings who recite his name and take them to the Pure Land. This is sort of a universal practice. And so, as you can imagine, this is very popular among lay people for two reasons, I think. One, it doesn't require a strict master-disciple relationship. So if you're in a situation where Buddhist resources are really thin, or if you're a layperson, who just is not able to devote the time to Buddhist stuff very much, Pure Land Buddhism is a nice supplement, or you can make it full-time if you want a full-time Buddhist practice of yours. It's a very easy. It's very friendly toward a layperson's lifestyle. And the second reason is that it definitely, because it's such an important part of Mahayana Buddhism in general, it also can sort of serve as a good foundation for other things. And this is what I found. So when I was interested in Pure Land Buddhism, when I first got interested in maybe 2005, at first all I did was just recite the Buddha's name, Amitabha Buddha, Namo Amitabha, Namo Amitabha. And this was a rosary that I used, that sometimes I would count it, 100 times, 1,000 times, sometimes even 4,000 times at a time, which 4,000 times you can do in about an hour. But as I did this, it created a kind of foundation for myself, a greater sense of confidence in the Buddhist teachings, and as a foundation, it allowed me to then branch out into other things over time. I started spending a lot more time studying Buddhist doctrine in general, and trying to understand how Pure Land Buddhism fit in all this, and that helped me along the way to understand Buddhism in general, which in the long run helped me make these videos. So now, having said that, there are different approaches to Pure Land Buddhism, as I alluded to earlier. So in the case of Japanese Buddhism, they tend to be more split between Zen and Pure Land Buddhism, and that's not always the case. Some schools actually do blend the two. But in the case of Chinese Buddhism, or mainland Asian Buddhism, China, Korea, Vietnam, there's a greater tendency to blend Zen teachings with Pure Land teachings, so that there's a great emphasis on mindfulness and paying attention as you recite or visualize Amitabha Buddha. And if you were to see this, if you were to see Japanese Buddhism, this is not emphasized. Now you may see this and say, well, these are two totally different schools. Which one should I follow? Based on my experience, reading various books over the years, I've kind of realized that really they're not mutually exclusive. They're just simply emphasizing different aspects, because in order to attain rebirth in the Pure Land, you do need to have both faith in the sense of your desire to be reborn in the Pure Land, and confidence in the sense that it will work if you recite the Buddha's name. But also, you also need to put that into practice somehow. So my experience has been that Japanese Pure Land Buddhism tends to emphasize the faith side of it more, relatively speaking, while the mainland Asian version tends to emphasize the practice side more, mindfulness and actually reciting it and so on. However, a lot of good Chinese Buddhist texts will tell you that faith is very important. You have to actually want to go to the Pure Land. And at the same time, Japanese Pure Land certainly emphasizes the need to practice it, reciting the Buddha's name. So really, they're just two sides of the same coin. Either way, the key to really getting the most out of Pure Land Buddhism is definitely studying the sutras. We'll talk about that in a second. and also really genuinely wanted to go there, regardless of your own circumstances, but wanted to be born in the Pure Land. And just reciting the Buddha's name. You can recite it 10 times, you can recite it 100 times, you can recite it 1 time, it doesn't really matter. So, now for those who would like to learn more about Pure Land Buddhism, or just kind of know where all this comes from, the 3 main sources are what are called the 3 Pure Land Sutras. Now these are the 3 sort of core Buddhist sutras that comprise the Pure Land teachings, and a lot of the stuff I mentioned here are actually come straight from these 3 sutras. Now, when I say 3, I'm talking about the 3 most important sutras. In the Mahayana canon, from one source I've read, there are 290 different sutras that mention Amitabha and the Pure Land in some form or another, including the Lotus Sutra. But these are the ones that sort of go into the greatest detail and describe. So the first one is the Sutra of Immeasurable Life. That's the longest, and that's historically the oldest composed sutra. And that talks a lot about the story of Amitabha, the 48 vows, the virtues of the Pure Land, and so on. The Amitabha Sutra is the shortest, and historically it's the middle of the sutras. And this one is very short, but it's very popular for liturgical reasons, because it's pretty short, like the Heart Sutra, but also talks a lot about the Pure Land itself, and has a lot of interesting snippets of wisdom that make it popular for commentaries and things like that. For example, Thich Nhat Hanh, the famous Vietnamese monk, wrote a commentary on the Amitabha Sutra, and there's a lot of other ones that I like reading because everyone has a slightly different take on it, but they're all pretty consistent. And the third one is the Contemplation of Amitabha Sutra. That's historically the most recent, and some people think that it may have been composed in China as opposed to India, but it also spends a lot of time talking about the importance of visualization of Amitabha, and also reiterates the ability to be reborn in the Pure Land by being born, by reciting his name 10 times. So, again, based on my personal experience, the reading, especially the Immeasurable Life Sutra and the Amitabha Sutra, are by far the best sources of information. And if you find them inspiring, that's usually a good point to start reciting the Buddha's name. Because if you're inspired and you feel like, yeah, I want to go to the Pure Land, recite the name, there you go. So, we've covered a lot of ground in this. This is a particularly long Q&A, but it's a pretty broad subject, and I wanted to make sure I gave it a thorough treatment if I could. So we've talked about the history of Pure Land Buddhism. What is Pure Land Buddhism within the context of Asian Mahayana Buddhism? Why people would want to go to the follow Pure Land Buddhism, and the different ways people try and do that. So, hopefully you found this interesting. Even if you're not interested in Pure Land Buddhism, hopefully it helps kind of demystify how it works within Buddhism. And hope you enjoyed this. So, thanks again for watching. Bye bye.